Hi friends, Father Carey here, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one on an argument for the existence of God embedded deeply within Leo Tolstoy's magisterial novel, War and Peace. I call it the incomprehensibility argument for the existence of God. It's not an incomprehensible argument. It is an argument about incomprehensibility when it comes to God. You'll find this interesting argument in Volume 2, Part 2, and Section 2 of War and Peace. The argument is offered to us in a conversation that takes place between one of the main characters of the novel, Pierre Bezukhov, and a stranger whom he meets at an inn. They begin talking about God, at which point Pierre says he does not believe in God. And the stranger then says this to him. And in what the stranger says lies the incomprehensibility argument for the existence of God. Listen. If he did not exist, the stranger said softly, we wouldn't be talking about him, my dear sir. What? Whom are we talking about? Whom have you denied? Who invented him if he doesn't exist? Why has the supposition appeared in you that there is such an incomprehensible being? That's an interesting thing to say, and within it is at least an abbreviated argument for the existence of God. Here's what I think is going on. The stranger says to Pierre, okay, you don't believe in God. You don't believe in what you call this incomprehensible being. But let me ask you something. Where did the sheer idea of an incomprehensible being, regardless of whether or not you believe in it, come from? Does it come from your ordinary experience of life? Does it come from your senses? Think about it for just a second. Where does the notion of an incomprehensible being arise? Now, if Pierre says to the stranger, which he doesn't, by the way, in the novel, but if he were to say to the stranger, well, I've gotten it from my senses, the stranger could very well reply something like this. Really? Your senses give you comprehensible information. Every bit of information that your senses provide you is comprehensible. Now you can stack up a mountain full of comprehensibles and they will never roll over into an incomprehensible. You can't squeeze an incomprehensible from a bunch of comprehensibles. That kind of argument is very similar for those of you who are philosophical aficionados to Hume's insistence in the 18th century that you can't squeeze an ought from an is. Think about what incomprehensibility when it comes to God suggests. It suggests, for example, at least infinity and eternity. And we simply do not comprehend what those two words mean. And yet we have the idea of these two incomprehensible words within us. We use the words. We can't have derived them from our senses any more than we could have derived an incomprehensible God from our senses. Because once again, time in which you and I dwell is comprehensible. Space in which you and I dwell is comprehensible. But infinity and eternity? No. Whence then did they come? Now, in 1841, Ludwig Feuerbach, a German philosopher, publishes a book called The Essence of Christianity. It's still in print. It's very popular. And what Feuerbach argues is that God doesn't really exist. God is simply a projection into the sky, if you will, of all of those human qualities which we find most admirable. It's just that we possess them in limited ways, and God possesses them in all-powerful ways. So you and I are capable of a little bit of love. God is all-loving. You and I are capable of a little bit of power. God is omnipotent. You and I are capable of a little bit of knowledge. God is all-knowing or omniscient. That, according to Feuerbach, is all that God is. But that, after all, is not an incomprehensible being, is it? It's not the idea of an incomprehensible being to have the idea of Feuerbach's God. Feuerbach's God is just a superhuman, as it were, endowed with superhuman abilities. So that, once again, invites us to ask ourselves, where does the idea of an incomprehensible being / God come from? The suggestion on the part of Tolstoy at this point seems to be that the idea has been implanted within us, that the idea of an incomprehensible being, since we can't have inferred it from the sensible world in which we live, must be implanted in us as an innate idea, just like the concepts of infinity and eternity, incomprehensible as they are, must have been implanted within us, because they too are not discernible or inferable from sensual experience. And what's capable of implanting such an idea in our mind? Well, nothing other than God. So the very fact Tolstoy's interlocutor seems to be saying that you and I have within us the idea of an incomprehensible being points to the reality of an incomprehensible being. Now, whether this argument is sound or not, my friends, I leave to your discernment. But it does seem to me that it's an intriguing argument, and one that I was surprised to run across in a novel. My friends, this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much for watching. If you are of a mind, I invite you to subscribe. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.